In the first two parts of section 2 of the introduction, Badiou has set up the idea that truths being characterized by their infinity and also by their relation to determinate worlds are forever incomplete. They're forever open to future workings and reworkings and transformations and redeterminations. So in the next part, he's going to give a concrete example from mathematics to illustrate this, and to illustrate the idea that when you're dealing with the difference between a finite case and an infinite case, that the modes of reasoning and of demonstration or proof are different. So he's been talking about that mainly philosophically. Let's put up there. And now he's going to descend, if you want. Maybe you could reverse the directions, but let's say he's going to descend into a particular truth procedure, mathematics, and then he's going to draw more abstract philosophical lessons from that example. And we've already said that this is Badiou's practice, that he gives a certain privilege to mathematics. So we're going to see it over and over again in this book, that he's talking philosophically. He goes and works through, sometimes rapidly as here, and sometimes at length, mathematical examples, and then he repoetizes, to use one of his words for describing the relation between philosophy and mathematics, and then redescends into mathematics, reascends. And well, in fact, there's no absolute privilege to mathematics there, because he's going to do the same thing with the other truth procedures. He'll be talking about a philosophical idea, descend into a poetic example, a poem from René Char or Mallarmé or Rimbaud or Pessoa, and then go back up to philosophy, up and down in a pulsation or swinging back and forth, that he will practice in relation to politics and love as well. And this is not unique to him. Deleuze does a similar thing. There is this constant back and forth, swinging back and forth, a pulsation that Badiou will characterize as dialectics, and that Deleuze most of the time, because he's got or he works most of the time with an idea of dialectics taken from Jean Hippolyte's version of Hegel, he will say that it's not dialectics but something else, although at other times, when he's thinking in terms of Albert Lautmann, as in difference and repetition, Deleuze will say that if by dialectics you mean the sorts of relations that you have between the virtual field of problematics and the actual field of solutions, then and problematics between themselves, you could call that a form of dialectics. So another difference is that Deleuze quite often uses mathematics for this pulsation between what is in fact the two ends of the spectrum that we saw in an earlier lecture, the spectrum of philosophy goes from more poetic end of the spectrum to a more mathematical end, and there is not just a place near the end of the poetic spectrum where some people reside, like supposedly Deleuze, when people in the analytic traditions say, that's just poetry. There's not another place where the really serious philosophers reside, which is close to the end of the mathematical end of the spectrum. If you're doing interesting work in continental philosophy, you're going back and forth between the two extremes of the spectrum. And in fact, that's not the only spectrum, because in fact, with the four truth procedures, you can go back and forth between the more philosophical, poetic extreme and politics, back and forth, and philosophy and love. And I would say even the more poetical side of philosophy and poetry. And because you don't just stay in poetry, that will be suture, you go back and forth. So we can find these pulsations everywhere, and perhaps in relation to the example that we're going to consider today, or in this chapter, and the philosophical conclusions that Badiou draws, we may say that Badiou goes through the mathematical procedure to get to these conclusions by repoetizing out, and we shall see that perhaps Deleuze does a similar thing by descending into a seemingly less technical procedure, which is or domain, which is language itself, and then poetizes, depoetizes, repoetizes, just like Badiou. So the sort of home base domain for the depoetization may vary, but this process of pulsation or swinging is shared by at least these two thinkers. So Badiou says that he's going to show us a difference in the mode of demonstration, in the mode of reasoning, between the finite case and the infinite case, and that to do that he's going to limit himself to mathematics, but that this general thesis or general conclusion as to the different modes of demonstration, depending on whether the case is finite or not, is not at all confined to mathematics. The section 3 is called an ontological theorem concerning the finite and the infinite. And the theorem is a theorem discovered by Cantor at the end of the 19th century, and it's a theorem concerning the power set, which is the set of all subsets of a given set. He's going to go fairly fast through that. So first he explains, well, not through the proof, he really goes into the proof, but he's going to go fairly fast through the sorts of conclusions and commentaries and poetic extrapolations that you can get from this sort of theorem. If you want, because the book, as I'm making these videos, is still not translated, you can go back to the book being an event, in which case meditation 7 on the point of excess and meditation 8 on the state or metastructure in the typology of being, and meditation 26 on the concept of quantity and the impulse of ontology, which talks about the quantitative comparison of infinite sets, are quite useful to get a sort of expanded analysis of this theorem and its proof. And it's if you don't know anything about set theory, it can seem complicated. But if you don't know anything at all about set theory, you can read the book, but you're going to have to do a lot of work to make sense of it. So if you have just even a small a smattering of knowledge about set theory, you already know this about the power set. And to refresh your memory, you can just go on Wikipedia and jump around and you'll find out all that you really need to know, or any basic textbook or introduction to set theory will deal with this theorem. So he's deliberately choosing a simple and pretty accessible theorem. So Badiou states this theorem as, in a given multiple, so a multiple is a set, whatever it is, the parts are enormously more numerous than the elements. So the enormously, I suppose that's true. He's sort of going fast because when the sets are very small with 2 or 3 or 4 elements, it's not really enormously more, unless you're putting yourself in a world composed of 2 or 3 or 4 elements, and then it would seem disproportionate to someone located in that world. But fairly quickly it becomes true that it's not just more, a lot more, but it's enormously more once you get more and more elements. And that leads to the further point that so the number of parts or subsets of a set is enormously more than the number of the elements. So you need to know the difference between elements and parts, between belonging to a set, an element belongs to a set, and a part or a subset is included in a set. So the conclusion is that once you deal with infinite multiplicities, the parts are infinitely more numerous than the elements. So that's once again going along with the big thing we saw from the first page, that Cantor introduced the idea that we have infinites of different sizes. And so they're not just of different sizes, they're somehow a higher infinite would just have a little more than a lower infinite. It's infinitely more numerous than the lower infinites. Straight away, to give us some sort of feeling for the importance of this theorem, before even getting into the proof, Badiou goes into a political example. That's what he usually does with this theorem, but we shall see that he takes great care all through the book to sometimes give a political example, sometimes an artistic, sometimes artistic and poetic, sometimes an example taken from love, and sometimes an example taken from other parts of mathematics. So he varies the examples. Sometimes he'll give 2 examples from radically different domains, so we can see how general the conclusion is. but he likes to do a political example with this theorem. So he says that this theorem signifies that the collective resource is infinitely more numerous than the individual resource. So the individual resource is you take a group or a state and you count the individuals as when you make the individuals vote. That will give you some idea of what's going on in the state in this case. The other idea is you take the groupings of individuals, and individuals can be grouped in many different ways, and in fact enormously more ways than the number of individuals. So that's sort of the idea of what could be behind polls and surveys. You're trying to get an idea not just of a particular group, but of the different groupings that exist or are possible inside that group. But that can never be, you can never do enough polls and surveys. You're always going to be surprised. There's always going to be a lot more going in these collective groupings than there is in each person taken singly, and in the small number of groupings that you're going to accede to by whatever technique of the investigation you've got. You just don't have the resources to exhaust all those possibilities, because there are enormously more than the number of individuals, and we can't do a survey on all the individuals, so we're certainly not going to be able to do a survey that covers all the different possible groups. So in that case, Badiou concludes that the mode of legitimation or legitimacy is totally different. The vote will, the majority vote, will give you a political leader who has been elected to represent the individuals, but that's one sort of legitimacy, but can easily be either obliged to quit, impeached, or just bypassed by the fact that there are all these collective groupings that are in number far superior to the number of individuals who voted one way or another, and something else can emerge, other leaders can emerge, and other directions can emerge that become far more important than the representative of the majority vote. So the conclusion from this mathematical theorem is that individualism, supposedly the pinnacle of evolution, is a very poor doctrine, and it considerably restrains and constrains the possibilities compared to what collective groupings are capable of. So Badiou reiterates his overarching idea before going on to the proof of this theorem, that there's an absolute difference in the demonstration or the proof of the theorem for the finite case and for the infinite case. So I'm not really going to go through the details of the proofs. You can find them on Wikipedia. I think he treats it a little differently in Being an Event, but you can find one version of the proof there. But the idea is that you can use what is sort of a proof by induction and recurrence. And this goes for all sorts of theorems that you may want to prove, and he's going to give it a more precise, give the theorem a more precise form for the finite case. If a set has n elements, the set of its parts, or the set of its subsets, has 2 to the power of n elements. So that's why very rapidly 2 to the nth power is not just more than, but enormously more than n. That's why he described it in the general qualitative form first of enormously more, and now we get the more precise worked out number. A set of n elements has as its power set, the set of all its of all the subsets formed out of its elements, has the cardinality of to the power of n. So the proof is simple. You prove a general principle that if it's true for n elements, it's going to be true for the next element, which is set with n plus 1 elements. And then by inspection, you show that it's true for a set with 1 element and 2, and so it will be by the fact that if it's true for n, it's true for n plus 1, it'll be true for 3, it'll be true for 4, for 5, and so on to infinity. So to infinity, that means it just goes on. So we're talking about the infinity of the natural numbers, and that's all, no other infinity. So his remark is the method is or relies on an essentially finite construction, the passage from one number, from one whole number, to its successor, from n to n plus 1. And almost you could say it's a lazy method, because if you had the time and the energy, you could go through all the cases, but you never stop. But you just prove the general principle. If it's true for n, it's true for n plus 1, and then empirically speaking, in a certain sense, by inspection, that's true for 1, 2, or 3, whenever you want to stop, and then it just applies to all the successor numbers. And he says that the interesting thing is that form of reasoning is not just about a finite number of objects, but it's a finite type of method about these objects. So we can conclude that the underlying doctrine is that since we only ever deal with the finite, thought itself must obey finite protocols, finite modes of reasoning, finite methods. So the thesis of finitude is a double whammy. Everything is just finite, and so thought is going to be constrained to thinking in a finite mode type of way. Then that was section 4. Section 5 is the demonstration, or the proof, in the infinite case. And there it's less precise. He doesn't put a number on it, like to the power of n, because that's a separate question. But it's just, if a set is infinite, it can have neither less parts than the number of elements, nor as many parts. So if you can have neither less nor the same number of parts as the number of elements. It has more. So already it's a little more complex in its formulation. And Badiou considers that as soon as we enter into the consideration of the infinite, we're changing our mode of thinking, and that thought becomes, in a sort of way, immanent to the infinite. So by the mode of procedure of thinking about the infinite and in mathematics and constructing our proofs, we're installing ourselves directly, straight away, in the infinite itself. So once again, he's going to give a sort of more general reflection to motivate the importance of this second prong or second type of case for the proof, the infinite case. So here he gives two examples, one from art and one from politics. So the example from art is artistic evaluation, evaluating works of art. And he says that there's no way that you can evaluate a work of art according to finite, controllable procedures. You can't program your evaluation or your aesthetic judgment by finite quantitative methods. And the principle of judgment over bounds or overflows the finitude of the judgment. Sure, you're going to make finite judgments in a particular case and place and time. You're going to make a finite judgment, but the principle behind you even making that judgment is itself infinite and is going to tell you that it's not finished when you've made your judgment, that it's always open to reinterpretation. You can change your interpretation later, or other people later in time or in other places can have different interpretations. The work can be the work of art can be reapplied, transformed, reinterpreted, and it's open-ended. It's always incomplete. So the procedures of reinterpretation of aesthetic judgment are infinite. And there's no protocol that can fix or fixate or stop their evaluation. You're always going to have to begin again in a different context. So that's what we saw in the first part of the introduction, the first page of the book. Truths are eternal in this untimely sense, that they're available for application and transformation within determinate worlds. They're not fixed and just oblige you to apply them whenever and wherever you are. They're infinite, and they oblige you, when you become a subject of that truth, to adapt, apply, rework, and transform the truth. The other example comes from politics. It's, according to Badiou, the grand problem of accepting the infinity of the future. So there's no final program or program for a final state. You can't enclose yourself in a fixed programmatic given. Political judgment is a judgment which can only leave the future open, and to once again, like for the work of art, to evaluate the future you are obliged to use procedures of immanence and of prediction, but that can never degenerate into a program. And given that one way of seeing this difference between the inner state, between the number of elements and the number of groupings of those elements into subsets, Badiou is going to call that the difference between state and society. A program, something programmatic, is only a program for the transformation of the state, whereas society and the transformation of society is submitted to working with truths and working with the infinite. So no program can regulate that transformation. You may need a program for specific segments and tactical goals in a social transformation, but no program can encompass the whole of the process or close it off. So to get to this proof, Badiou claims we're going to be invoking the second type of immanence of truths. Remember, we started for truths having four trays. They're absolute, eternal, generic, and universal. And immanence has three trays. Immanence of truths. The truths are produced in a particular determined world. Secondly, truths are immanent in a relation between the finite and the infinite. And thirdly, subjects are immanent to, incorporated in, truths in their absoluteness. They're the three trays that characterize the immanence of truths. And so in this proof, which seems quite normal, we're going to use the second type of immanence, which is the singular connection between the finite and the infinite. So we're talking about the difference between the infinite, we're talking about the difference between the individual resource and the collective resource, and the difference of scale. And the reasoning is going to be in terms of a figure of infinity. So we're not just dealing with a finite infinite sets, we're dealing with an infinitized, because infinity adapted reasoning. Badiou concludes this section 5 of part 2 with a Heideggerian type affirmation. The infinite infinitizes thought itself. So there's a sort of echo of those sort of koans that Heidegger would indulge in, going back to the nothings, which some people like Rudolf Carnap rejected absolutely. That was a refutation of the meaningfulness of Heidegger's system. We can note that Badiou doesn't stop with the infinite infinitizers. Probably it does. It does. But the infinite infinitizes thought itself. So it's ontological, but it's noetic as well. So he goes on to part 6, Cantor's demonstration, or Cantor's proof 1, the power of the impossible. This, oddly enough, is not yet the proof itself, but it prepares us by reminding us or establishing what a one-to-one correspondence means. So when you have two sets of elements, one-to-one correspondence means that to each element in one set or group, you corresponds an element and only one element in the other group, and vice versa. In French, this is called correspondance biunivoque, and often the people who translate from French are more literary types. They don't realize that usually the ordinary term for that in English, even amongst mathematicians, is one-to-one correspondence. Biunivocal correspondence exists, but you don't, unless you're making abstruse comparisons with other types of correspondence, all you need to say is one-to-one correspondence. So I don't know how the translators, the English translators of this book, are going to translate that term. I hope they say one-to-one correspondence, because I find that a more intuitively easy to understand. It's less sort of Latinate with biunivocal correspondence. People who translate Guattari, and so Deleuze and Guattari like talking about biunivocality and so on, but it's just one-to-one correspondence. So the second element of context or mathematical or logical background that we need is, and he takes more time on this because he draws interesting philosophical conclusions from it. It's the notion of indirect proof by reductio ad absurdum, reduction to the absurd. That is to say, you've got a thesis that you want to prove, but you can't find a way to prove it directly. In the case of infinite sets, that will be often the case. So you take the antithesis, if you want. Instead of P, you take not P, and you try and deduce all the consequences of not P till you come to a contradiction. If you've come to a contradiction, then that shows that not P is false, and so the P is true. So you can't do it directly with P, you do it indirectly by means of not P and showing that not P explodes things. So you're back with P. And Badiou remarks that this is an indirect proof, and it shows that in the domain of the finite, you're in the domain of the infinite, you're in the domain of the dialectics, and you're in a domain where it's necessary to proceed by way of negation. So you want to demonstrate phi, he says phi instead of p, that's classy mathematical symbols using Greek ones, that makes it already more mathematical and classy. So Badiou has to conform to that convention of notation. So if you want to demonstrate phi, you are often obliged by the reasoning by the absurd. If you translate it directly, it's a reductio ad absurdum. To prove that the proposition phi, you give a demonstration of the impossibility of non-phi. So he says, philosophically speaking, that's you do that all the time in mathematics, but in fact there's something strange about it, and that's why some people have trouble getting their head around that idea, and why even mathematicians who can easily get their head around that idea, some claim that applying this sort of reasoning to infinite sets just is invalid. That's one group of mathematicians. But by Badiou's power set theorem, there are many more groups of mathematicians than there are mathematicians themselves. So that's just one group, and it's not today the majority group, and it's not Badiou's group or set of groups. Okay, so that means we want to prove phi, but we go into non-phi and try and find a contradiction. So it means, according to Badiou, that thought enters into infinity, because there are an infinite number of consequences that you can draw from non-phi. Thought enters into infinity without any guarantee. You don't know if you're going to find a contradiction or not. And it is this absence of guarantee which explains that one has always qualified this reasoning by the absurd, or reductio ad absurdum, as non-constructive. You can't construct it, so you're not in construction, you're in errance, wandering. What I characterized when I was talking about the forward to Laruelle's A Biography of Ordinary Man, you're a pilgrim on the paths of immanence, which are the paths of errance or wandering. So, in effect, you're hoping to find a contradiction, but you may not. You may just wander forever, lost in your antithetical hypothesis, antithesis, postulated antithesis. So, reasoning by the absurd, reductio ad absurdum, is obligatory when you're maneuvering in the infinite, and it is itself infinite. So, I think there's something we'll see in a couple of paragraphs that Badiou is not considering in this discussion. There's a third case. So you want to prove phi, you postulate non-phi. Well, you want to prove phi and you can do it directly. Or because it's an infinite set and it's a tricky property, you postulate non-phi and you wander in the infinite, looking desperately for contradiction, because it could take quite a lot of time and a lot of skill and knack and know-how to get a contradiction. Then you've won. You've proved that non-phi is impossible, and you're back to phi that you wanted to prove. A third case is you might wander so long that you give up and you say that phi, imagine the case where everyone thought phi was true and provable, but we just haven't got around to proving it. You come along and you say, well, I'll show them, I'll prove it by reductio ad absurdum, I'll deduce a contradiction from it, and you never do. So you might just sort of give up and say, I hope somebody else does. Or you can draw a stronger conclusion and you can say, so non-phi maybe is equally true, equally possible. So that's how non-Euclidean geometries were discovered. There's the famous parallel theorem between, given a point and a line, there's you can always draw one parallel that goes through the point, and only one that is parallel to the given line. That is a complicated axiom, and people thought for ages that it could be proved, that it was not of the sort of simplicity and self-evidence that's required of an axiom. So they thought we should be able to prove this. So people like Lobachevsky started out with the idea we can't derive it directly, so we're going to suppose it's false, and that another postulate is true. The idea, perhaps you can draw several lines through that point that are parallel to the given line, and by developing that, he didn't come to a contradiction. So he said, abracadabra, I don't know if he used those words, I've invented non-Euclidean geometry. So when you want to prove phi and you go through the positing of non-phi, there are more possibilities than Badiou wants to consider in this meditation. Anyhow, you're convinced of phi, you postulate non-phi, so Badiou says, in reality, you're installing yourself in a fiction. Non-phi for you is a fiction. And that it's an interminable work of art. He's talking about mathematics, but he's saying reductio ad absurdum is an interminable work of art because you've posited a fiction, and then you're what you think is a fiction, and you're drawing all the consequences. So that's an element of as if, and also he says I call this element the element of fiction. So in exploring non-phi, you're not really learning very much about phi. You're learning about the avatars of the of negation, in this case the negation of phi, and not frequenting, not experiencing the joys of affirmation. So he says that's why people prefer the finite and finite methods, because it's less fictional, more constructive, and I suppose by implication, if you really want exclusively the joys of affirmation, that's where you'll find affirmation and nothing else, if that's what you really want. So it's more comfortable, and it's more in scare quotes, more rewarding. And the other mode of reasoning by reductio ad absurdum is a prodigious invention in the history of humans, in human history, because it's the moment when thought takes the risk of something else than the constructions of which it is capable. So the constructivists are the finitists for him, in his sense of finite. They stay in the finite. They're also the conformists and the ideologues and the oppressors. Of course, finitude is oppression, and finitude is an illusion that is constructed out of two infinites rubbing together, as we've seen before. In politics, it's the moment when active thought takes the risk of something else or of something which is not reducible to state and power. So always this worry about reductionism. Politics focused on the state and on taking power is a reductionist politics. So he has, as he considers, illustrious forebears, epistemologists like Bachelard and Lacan himself have been able to affirm that truth presents itself always in the structure of a fiction, or truth presents itself under the disguise or the mask of error. The false is your guide towards the real, and the real is a point that's impossible to maintain, a point which will be inflicted on you to make you recoil from the forced admission of the truth of P. So he goes on, he's given the stakes there of that type of reasoning, and they're pretty high stakes. And then he's going to give a particular example now, the one he's been building up to, Cantor's proof of this theorem about the power set in the case of infinite sets. And he says Cantor proposes a demonstration by the absurd, by reductio ad absurdum, to his risks and perils. That is to say, in taking the risk of a sterile infinity if the point of contradiction is not found. So I've already indicated that that's not the only risk that is being taken by this form of reasoning. In Cantor's case, maybe that's so, but we don't need necessarily, if we fail to find a contradiction, end up with a sterile infinity. We may end up with a fecund infinity, which in Cantor's case that's not so, but somebody else might perform the same investigation and come up with non-Cantorian set theory. So anyhow, in this sort of reasoning, as in politics, you need a huge amount of patience, because the consequences of the false assumption, the consequences that are going to explode that assumption, are to be found in a point, a consequence, a conclusion that you do not know. Cantor's section 7, Cantor's demonstration or Cantor's proof 2, the technique of bumping against the impossible. So this is a complicated proof to state in words, so you need to look it up. As Badiou recounts Cantor's proof, it proceeds fairly standardly with a sort of a tricky, twisted moment, which is what you need to in mathematics to construct your counterexample, which makes your initial hypothesis explode. So the initial hypothesis that we're going to work with is you have an infinite set E and its power set PE, composed of all the possible subsets of E. The question is, do they have the same number of elements or not? PE can't have less. Maybe it has the same number, or maybe it has more. So to prove that it has more, we're going to suppose that it has the same number. The PE, the power set, has the same number of elements as the set E in the case of an infinite set. Calls it E because it's ensemble. Maybe in English translation you should call it S. I don't know. We'll see what they do. So we're going to suppose that there are the same number, and that means that there's a one-to-one correspondence between the elements of E and the elements of PE. And the elements of PE, as well, we know, are the subsets, or the different subsets of E. So if there's a one-to-one correspondence, that means that to each element of E there corresponds a part of E, or a subset of E, and these parts or subsets compose the elements of PE. There are two possible cases. An element alpha of E can belong to the subset that corresponds to it in PE, or it may not belong to the subset. You're not obliged to select the subset that corresponds to the list of elements in E in any way that makes them related in terms of the elements. That's just what comes up. So alpha can be in its corresponding subset or not. So alpha is sort of like the name in E of the corresponding subset in PE. So the question, the tricky part is, can there be, despite your supposition of the one-to-one correspondence and so of exhaustivity, every part in PE will have a corresponding element, and so a name in E. Is there some sort of anonymous part, a part that has no name, or a paradoxical quality to it? So Badiou says we construct the part, so it's a part of E, and so it's an element of PE. And we construct the part PA for paradoxical of E, which is composed of all the elements which do not belong to their corresponding subset. There are a certain number of them, and that's what a part or a subset is. That's a grouping that you can make and call that a subset of E. So this grouping or part of all the elements in E that don't belong to their corresponding subset in PE will have a name. So it's a part, so it's in an element of PE, and it'll have a name in E, which Badiou calls Ext. So it's Ext is the name of a part, And so X belongs to E. And he asks, this name E, which is the name of PA, the paradoxical subset, is it exterior or interior to the part PA, or the subset PA that it names? Is it a member of it or not? And he shows that if you suppose that it's a member of it, then it's not. And if you suppose that it's not a member of it, then it is. So I'll let you read the details for that. I've already got into quite a lot of detail there. The consequence is that the name X, which has a well-defined, valid definition in terms of the way we construct the definition, cannot exist. If it existed, it would have to be both inside PA, the paradoxical part, and outside PA, which is impossible. So that means that the idea that there's a there's a one-to-one correspondence between E and PE, its power set, breaks down in the infinite case, and that there is an unnameable part in a back and forth movement between the interior and the exterior. If it's exterior, it's interior. If it's interior, it's exterior. And he adds that it is characteristic of the infinite zone where our thought establishes itself that we encounter these paradoxical phenomena where interior and exterior are in pulsation or in dialectical relation. And anyhow, we've got to our proof that there's no one-to-one correspondence between the power set of an infinite set and the infinite set, the elements of the one and of the other. So the power set doesn't have the same number of elements, can't have less, and so it has more. So far so good, but that's a set theoretical result. Badiou wants to now demathematize and repoetize that result, looking at the type of proof that we've engaged in. And he says that what's interesting about this sort of proof is that it's a risky demonstration, and it takes the risk of encountering these sorts of paradoxical entities. And as well, it takes the risk of encountering them. And in mathematics, that's the end. You've encountered a paradoxical entity, so your initial hypothesis is wrong, assuming you haven't made any mistake in your reasoning. And the first hypothesis, the thesis of which you posited the antithesis, is right, is confirmed. But you're also taking the risk of not encountering a paradoxical entity, at least in a finite time, because the consequences of hypothesis are infinite in number. And so if you start up with a false hypothesis as your point of departure, who knows when and or even whether you're going to encounter this sort of refuting instance that is a paradoxical instance or entity in a finite amount of time. So you're taking a big risk. So 8, the conclusion is, we've proved, that's the mathematical part, strictly speaking, the mathematical content when you repoetize it. the collective resource of a situation is superior to its individual resource. So the collective resource creates more possibles or more possibilities. Secondly, we're in a connection between the finite and the infinite. And when we enter into such a connection, we're in the immanence of a relation between the finite and the infinite. And so thought can't be limited to simple calculation. It can't restrict itself or content itself with just going from one stage to the next. It can't be constructive in the sense of methodically going from one stage or level to the next stage or level. It's not methodical, it's automatically dialectical when you're in this relation between the finite and the infinite. And that means it's not a sort of well demarcated, limited, straight line. It's an itinerary with obstacles or possible obstacles on that journey. So that's what allows us to understand why the judgment of truth is not a calculable judgment. There's no calculation, there's no method that can guarantee the results of thought when you're in a relation between the finite and the infinite. All you've got is an itinerary, a wandering path in a situation of errance or wandering, and in a situation of risk. It's a situation of errance and risk, of wandering and danger. It's only when you encounter a paradoxical phenomenon, point of the impossible, that you are in the ordeal of the real of the situation, or I would also say the test of the real. So I think this more general conclusion we can already see shaping up a callback to Deleuze in Logic of Sense, who by a sort of complicated reasoning in terms of language extracts this concept of the paradoxical instance and then applies it all over the field to art, to politics, and ethics and creation in general. Badiou says, in the work of art, in the political situation, and even more so in the amorous situation, the situation of love, the question of knowing if one is constantly confronting incertitude as to the inside and the outside is constitutive of the process itself. And so he's widening its scope out far beyond mathematics there. He then goes back to a concrete example from another truth procedure than mathematics. It takes love, but as reflected in or analysed in art in terms of Proust. So in love, as in all the other procedures, you're going to come up against these paradoxical objects where you don't know whether it's inside or outside, and it's constitutive. In the case of mathematics, that means you throw the paradoxical instance away, and the hypothesis or the counter hypothesis that got you there. But in the case of love, Badiou says, reflecting on Proust, who's reflecting on love, either you're going to have a nihilist version of this, that because you don't ever know whether something is really inside the love or outside, it seems to be jumping between the two, you're going to be jealous, constantly jealous. That will be a truth of love for you. That's a nihilist way of living and analyzing love. And it's in the case of Proust, in Search of Lost Time, it comes to the conclusion that jealousy is the essence of love, and all things considered, you've lost your time with a woman who wasn't even your type. So that's the jealous approach to love, and this doubting about interiority and exteriority. But this doubting can be considered not as a disproof of love, but as a proof of love, that you're constantly in the paradoxical real of being confronted with the possibility that the interiority or the inside of love processes is really an outside, and vice versa. So you can't draw just a simple affirmative conclusion from being in this state of encounter of paradoxical phenomena and swinging back and forth. You have the dialectical possibility, which is positive, which is to say that the relation between inside and outside is the place or the site of infinite construction of the amorous process, or the love process itself. So either you're in the fork of nihilist jealousy, you meet up with these paradoxical phenomena and you recoil from them, and you fall into the nihilist trap of jealousy and then the pessimistic conclusion. That goes back to what Badiou said about doubt under the regime of relativism. In fact, this nihilist jealousy wants things to be determinate, and so wants just finite determination with nothing infinite at all. But because love itself is infinite, and will produce these paradoxical objects, the nihilist, jealous and doubting and ultimately pessimistic conclusion is it wasn't love at all, and in fact there is no love. And the second fork, or the second possible reaction, although reaction is a bad word, the second possibility is dialectical positivity based on the negativity, dialectical affirmation. And that is to say, when you encounter these paradoxical phenomena that are intrinsically uncertain, it's not just I am uncertain, I can't decide whether it's inside or outside, whether that's love or not, and whether that's what love is or not. When I'm in that sort of uncertainty, that's a case where the infinite is in relation to the finite, and that's a case where truth procedure, in this case a love procedure and love process, infinitely open to construction is taking place or is possible. So that's a case where this is the site of the infinite construction of the love process itself, and that's the situation in which it's a case not of ineluctable failure, but these sorts of paradoxical, uncertain situations are the matter and the principle of construction of the love process as they are of the other truth procedures. It's a question of reworking, constantly reworking the relation between inside and outside in such a way as to accept the situations of uncertainty, of switching or swinging between these inextricable options. So they're sort of like the beats of a rhythm, and battement is a word for sort of swinging, pulsation, and drum beats or beats, and these rhythmic beats are, in this case, the beats of the heart. Badiou goes all poetical, maybe even romantic. No, he's not going to fall back into romanticism. It is quite striking that at the most abstract level, that is to say in mathematics, as soon as we're dealing with the infinite, these processes of risky interiority and of detours by way of negation come up. This proves that the immanence of truths, even at the most schematic level, as in the fairly simple theorem. I mean, it was complicated to state in words, but it's a fairly simple theorem in mathematics, so it's schematic. In the most schematic, at the level of the most schematic or the most formal of truths, there is the possibility for human thought to infinitize itself in the risk that it encounters. And this risk is that of the present book in its entirety. So here we're getting a methodological declaration. Badiou is creating a system. It's systematic, it's rigorous, it's well grounded in working through of contemporary mathematics, and at the same time it's wandering the paths of immanence, encountering paradoxical objects and the various dangers inherent in the type of obstacles that one can come against, and that can make us have to work around them or go back to the beginning and start all over again, and in particular not know what belongs to the path that we're on and what is outside the path. So having constantly to orient and to reorient ourselves in the process of thinking things through.